Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. I'm so thrilled today to be joined by the fantastic David Weil, who is the creator, writer, and director of the Amazon Prime series Solos. And the first thing that I wanted to ask you about was with the writing process, because it's such a unique project and journey to create these individual stories that exist in their own intimate worlds and settings and have to have an entire narrative and arc all within the space of a single episode. And so what was the unique challenge and journey of writing, and how did it really cause you to shift from your previous process because of that?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for speaking with me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And what a great question. I think that, I approached each episode of Solos much in the way that I would a feature film or a series of television, where what are the three acts? What are the little mysteries and revelations every few minutes for these characters? And so, though it's condensed, I think it still needs to have just as much dynamism and mystery and thrill as possible. But I would say, the process was just such a beautiful one of who I was so uninhibited by plot that I could really just focus on who these characters are. What do they sound like? What are their secrets and dreams and desires and fears? I felt like I was just spending time getting to know them. And that was such a rare thing, to your question. I don't often get to do that in TV or film. But I try, like in Hunters, I try to have those great long monologues. We just don't usually have to cut them down because we don't have as much time. This was like I could just run free and run wild, and that was such a joy.
And because you were just mentioning the monologues, I mean, there's really beautifully written and constructed monologues that are, I imagine, pages long when you think of them in the scripts. And they're so stunningly delivered as well. And so, how, when you were even at the writing process, before you were even working with the cast on those monologues, how were you thinking about the breakdown, particularly in terms of the pacing and the structure and how that was going to flow into each episode?
I speak a lot of my writing out loud, so I could hear the. For me, writing is music, and it's like each piece should be its own symphony. And if the music is off, or the rhythm's off, or the instruments aren't playing correctly, like you just know it. It just becomes like a kind of guttural reaction where it's like, ooh, that's like way too long, or like, wait, I'm not getting enough of, this experience of hers here. So it was a constant like shaping and reshaping. It's almost like chiseling away at marble and like seeing what works and what doesn't. But to me, it's music, so I could just hear when something was off.
Yeah. And when you look at all of the episodes together, it's really interesting to see the different ways that you've threaded the connective elements and themes between them. And some of them are quite directly linked to each other, and then some of them are more standalone pieces. So how were you thinking about the construct, and where you wanted there to be a real connection to another episode, and where you wanted an episode to really just stand and live and breathe on its own?
I you're so right. Like thematically, I think those feelings of loneliness and solitude and yearning for human connection, that's all very present, right? And then there are episodes like Anthony Mackie's episode, Tom, and Helen Mirren's episode, Peg, that are very directly linked. Peg is his adopted, daughter. But I felt like if I did that in each episode, it would become a little too cute. It would defy the reality that I was actually trying to achieve, which is that I want this to be a piece about human connection. But I didn't want it to feel like a movie, or a TV show. And I think at times there are certain shows or films that everyone's connected by this like very explicit way. I want it to be a bit more thematic. You do have the great revelation, in Morgan Freeman and Dan Stevens' episode, that Morgan has experienced memories of all the individuals that we have seen. But which should be a secret, sorry, and until the show airs. But you do have this great revelation in Morgan Freeman's episode that something happens and that there is a connection, that he is directly connected to each of the individuals. But yeah, I think the balance was key.
Did you always know when you were writing them the order in which you were going to tell these stories? Because I think of it very much akin to the idea of putting together a mixtape where you're thinking not just about, okay, this song sounds great before this one, but you're thinking about the emotional journey that you want to take the audience on as well.
Absolutely, and it's a great metaphor because I think today on Spotify or whatever we listen to, we shuffle all the time, right? So like part of the thrill I think of Solos and part of my intent was that the audience should really feel free to experience the episodes in the order that they see fit. We like this idea of like choosing your own memory. And so while I first wrote Tom and then Peg, when I constructed the piece, and we do release them in a specific order, If people want to, jump ahead or fall back or whatever, I would encourage that. I would say certainly wait for the Morgan Freeman, Dan Stevens episode, Stewart, for the end, because it does have some great little revelations. But otherwise, I think it might be really an interesting experience to view them how a viewer sees fit.
Yeah. And as you went into production on the entire project, I imagine that it was a lot like having 7 different individual productions just all running at the same time, because, there's no linearity. The production design elements are completely unique in every single one. They each have their own stylistic aesthetic. So how were you really just allowing each episode to tell you what it needed from you as a creator, as you were overseeing all of these mini productions with the rest of your team?
It really was like shooting 7 different pilots in 7 different genres with 7 different stars. And so I think it was just being open to the challenges that each production had its own challenges and its own opportunities. Each episode, so the best thing I could do as a showrunner was, how can I support this piece? What does the director need? What does the actor need? What does our production designer, our brilliant costume designer, Shiona Tarini, need? Our cinematographer, Will Rexer. But that was also the fun. It's flexing these different muscles and playing these different tones and genres. Every few days was a different adventure for the crew. And so I think that was part of the excitement of this show, that it was never the same, that you were always on your feet thinking about different ways to solve different issues.
Yeah. And you also directed some of the episodes, but worked with other directors on some of the episodes as well. And so when you were working with the rest of the directors, what were the things that were so important for you to instill in them in terms of the overall creative vision? Because, you're bringing in really fantastic filmmakers who are bringing their own vision, but you still want to have that stylistic aesthetic, which again, just ties everything together.
Absolutely. I think the hiring process, honestly, was the best and most important part of the process, because I wanted to make sure that we were working with filmmakers who had such clear visions, but also were incredibly collaborative. And the best thing that I could do for Tiffany or Sam or Zach was say to them, how can I support you? Like, how can I support your vision? I love, as a writer, the interplay and collaboration with a filmmaker, because they're going to come with their own set of ideas. And these are 3 really auteuristic filmmakers who have such clear points of view, such different styles. So I do think, with William Rexer and our cinematographer, and with Amin and Shiona Tarini, our production designer and costume designer, we were the connective tissue. I think that we made sure that each piece affirmed humanity in some kind of way, but I also wanted to be incredibly flexible and allow Zach and Sam and Tiffany to have their say, to really declare what their piece is about.
And similarly, with that idea of collaboration, the cast that you've brought onto this project are actors who really come with a sense of what they can turn something in the page into, and bring a lot to every single character in terms of layers and complexities. And so I was really interested in the journey of working with the cast and having a lot of conversations about what was going on with these characters beyond what we see in the page, so that they could bring the performances that we ultimately get to see.
I mean, first of all, it was a masterclass and a dream come true. And like, how do I get to do this? Like, what? Like, what? This is so surreal. It's a fantasy. But you're right, Mara. Like, let's take Peg, for example. I tried to create a character with great nuance and great dimensions and depths. But until Helen Mirren brought her to life, I mean, with the bat of an eyelash or the turn of a head or an eye, her eye line being out to there, and you could see her beautiful eyes kind of well up with emotion. I can't write that. I can't. She just was the character. She existed as the character. And I think discovered so much in every take that she did, that just brought what was on the page, this character on the page, into reality. So, we certainly had wonderful discussions and did such great prep work with Uzo and Anthony and Helen and Maury, everybody. Constance, oh my gosh, she's so genius. But, the actors just did it. They just brought their work. They did so much of the homework beforehand. And then they all said something, earlier today that I found so interesting. Helen and Morgan and Constance said it. But there was a lot of prep work, but they also just wanted to live in the truth of the moment. They didn't want to prepare too much, because they wanted to have that great feeling of reality and discovering things and speaking like the characters speak in a stream of consciousness kind of way, without it feeling too designed.
And what was the difference when you had episodes where there's actors performing against themselves? So we have Anthony Mackie and we have Anne Hathaway who have other versions of themselves within the film, within the series, because they're playing against a version of themselves that's very much like them, but they're either different because it's kind of a clone situation or it's their character in a different space and time. So you really want to have that linearity again, but you really want to find the small nuances in what makes them different.
Absolutely, Mara. And it's such a Venn diagram because one approach is to say, well, I'll make each of these characters so different. But in Annie's case, with Leia, it's the same character, just in different, periods of her life. So it has to be both the similarities and the differences, nuanced things that, each character does, little ticks or little, habits. But then also, how does the character change over time? Or for Anthony, who's so brilliant, he's playing himself as Tom, he's playing Tom, and then he's playing Tom's AI clone, Edward. And so what is an AI experience? What do they intuit and express, And so there was so much work that was done there. I would say that for Annie in particular, man, what a collaborator. I mean, from day one, and part of the reason that Solos even exists is because of Annie and her passion for the series. She was the first person I really spoke to about the show. And she was so integral in the writing process because I think that she was so eager to very clearly define Leia in the past, Leia in the present, Leia in the future, and we would send each other script pages back and forth and go back and forth on realizing the specificity of who this character was at the three different ages. And then with Anthony, I just feel like the mastery of his performance is that when he was performing Tom, he also had to envision himself as Edward across the couch from him and know how Edward would be reacting. So he was almost performing as two different characters at the very same time. And that was just so, transfixing to watch as a director.
I'm also really interested in a lot of the blocking throughout the entire show, even going beyond the episodes that you directed, because it feels like there's a real sense of stillness, and yet it still feels very dynamic inside of each of the episodes and really pulls us into the emotion of each of them. And I feel like Uzo's the one that moves around the most, but then when you think about Constant, she's pretty much delivering an entire performance, just sitting completely stationary and really finding the stillness in her performance. Was that something that was a really conscious decision of yours early on, and how did that come to influence a lot of the blocking and then even a lot of the camera work in these episodes?
Absolutely. Mara, I wish you were on set. These questions are, it's so true. It's as if you were there with us the whole time, truly, because, I think we looked at each piece and said, what does the piece demand, right? So for example, I think Constance's piece, Jenny, Becca Bowling wrote this beautiful story that is so layered and there's so much energy about it. Like it is its own marching, beating drum that if I were to, have the camera work be very busy and Will and I were, we're moving the camera in such a dynamic way, it almost would feel like a hat on a hat. It almost would be like overload of dynamism. And so I almost felt like the best thing I could do as a filmmaker in that episode was keep the camera quite still because her perspicacity and her absurdity and her sort of power, drove the series in such a beautiful way. You look at something like Peg, and I think that, Sam Taylor Johnson created poetry out of the piece. Helen Mirren as Peg is sitting still, in a single chair in a space pod, telling this very beautiful story. And you wouldn't know it, but the camera never stops moving. Like the camera is constantly dancing around her. It's like a ballet. It's like poetry. And so I think that gentle kind of delicate movement, was almost comforting to the character of Peg. I don't think you want to be, hyper cutting Peg. It's just not fair to her. This is a woman who is for the first time sharing her truths. And so I think you want the camera as a participant and as an audience member to show her the respect that she so deserves. And then of course for Leia, Zach is so dynamic and his thoughts are like, he has a million brilliant ideas and Annie is so dynamic and they wanted a lot of just energy and movement. And so you feel like that piece is so dynamic.
And you touched there just now on the closeness of the camera. And it's almost like slightly disconcerting the first time the camera does it, because we're not used to the camera sitting quite so close to an actor's face. And again, that's a tactic that's employed multiple times throughout the entire series, and really done to great effect, particularly because, I mean, you can't take your eyes away when the camera is right here on Helen Mirren. There's nothing else that you're going to look at in your room, watching it in a cinema or watching it on a TV screen. And again, was that something that you thought about with the rest of the directors early on, and just like having that sense of close up and intimacy to really bring us into the performances?
Absolutely. The power of the piece to me, and my great ambition for it, was that for an audience member watching to feel as if they are the only one in a room with this great actor and character, and that Leia or Nira is speaking and emoting and performing only for them. So to really try and recreate a live theater experience, but one that's even more intimate and nuanced. And so I really wanted to pull the viewer into that experience where, what if they were in the room with Helen? They would see her eyelashes batting. They would see Constance Wu's, her cheek turning to the left and feeling the emotional quality of that, at a time where there is, we didn't have much connection. I really wanted this piece to feel hyper connected, that you could feel the intricacies and intimacies of every movement with each of these characters.
And then jumping into the science fiction element, it's really fascinating to see how you can create a world of science fiction with such a limited amount of effects and trickery. When you think about Uzo's episode, it's like there's one computer gadget in the corner, but she's really just in a regular location. Anthony Mackie's one that we were talking about earlier, where he's an AI clone of himself. There's two performers and they're just in a beautiful living room setup. There's actually nothing else technologically going on around them. And was it something where early on, even in the writing process, where you started to think about creating this really intimate portrayal of science fiction and really stripping down and staying away from effects a lot of times, even though there are episodes that lean further into it?
Certainly. I think that my favorite science fiction are ones that project humanity, not project technology, but project humanity. Of how do our current dreams and desires affect the kinds of technologies that we want to create, right? And so these pieces are just human pieces. The sci-fi element, I'm the biggest sci-fi geek in the world, but I think what it really allows us to do as a genre is reflect on our current state of affairs, our current society, and our current state of being. I wanted to set out and tell a very human story about human connection, but I felt like if I set the piece in 2021, it would be really hard to disconnect from the realities and the experiences that we're all feeling. Like, we're all living it, So like, I didn't want to make a show about exactly what we are living in the moment. I think by creating a bit of a gulf between now and the future, and expressing these very futuristic stories, it allows an audience a gentler mode of reflection. I think it encourages and invites reflection. And it doesn't feel like I'm trying to jam that down your throat or trying to say, hey, connect, emote, feel. Instead, I really want that to creep up on the viewer. And I do feel like these sci-fi worlds that are created will allow someone to do that.
And then when there are the episodes where there's a little bit more in terms of on-screen effects, like Anne Hathaway's and Helen Mirren's episodes, how were you all thinking about the journey and the process of what you wanted that to visually look like? Because when you look at those two episodes side by side, they don't look anything like each other. Again, they've got their completely unique worlds. And you really have created effects that if we watch this 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it's still going to feel really timeless, and it's not going to be like, well, that was clearly made in 2021. And so was that also something that you were thinking about as you were figuring out what those effects and what those visuals were going to look like for episodes like that?
Absolutely. 2001 is my favorite film of all time. And so I take, all the lessons I learned of science fiction comes from that. And I think 2001 is a science fiction film that if it were released today, we would say, oh my God, those effects and the models, and it looks so futuristic, but it was made such a long time ago. And so, I think that, again, the success of a film like that is because it was science fiction expressing humanity and where we would be as human beings. So it's an extension of ourselves. I think for the Helen Mirren episode, we used a great volume wall. And we, when she was on set, we had the stars in the sky outside actually moving. And what was so exciting to, Sam Taylor Johnson, who directed the episode, and to myself, was that we could create a kind of reality for Helen, that she could feel space outside versus like green screens, just outside the spaceship windows. For the Leia episode, Zach Braff had such a vision for what he wanted those holograms to look like. But again, we didn't want them to feel too futuristic and then it kind of pulls you out, nor do we want it to feel like it's 1985 and like, she's just looking on the screen. So we wanted to feel her in the room. I think honestly, the ideology for all the visual effects in the piece was, how do we make this feel real and how do we make it feel human?
And in directing episodes yourself as well, this was the first time that you were stepping behind the camera in that way. But obviously you've spent, endless hours writing and producing and being on set and show running before. And so what were some of the skills and tools that you realized you'd been subconsciously developing during all that time and working collaboratively and so closely with other directors?
That's such a good question. I think the best thing I learned as a writer and a showrunner on Hunters, especially, was just how to work with the actors. How to try and support them, how to listen. The best skill set as a showrunner is to listen. What do people need? What are they trying to achieve? What do they want? And so too, that works for directors even more so, because I think the director so intimately, is working with the production designer, the costume designer, the line producer. What's our budget? What can we achieve? All right, maybe if we sacrifice this scene here, we can actually use that time or energy or creativity or money for this great scene. Now having directed, I've become a much better writer, a much better editor of my own work, and I'm much less precious, I think, textually speaking, when I write scripts, because I say, well, we may not need that to communicate the story, or let's do this visually, or let's allow just the actor to perform. I don't need to write a 8-page, scene to express the same thing that we can do with a look of the eye, So it was such a wonderful interplay. I became a much stronger writer, truly, now having directed.
And I also wanted to, talking of your writing, ask you a little bit about your early career in that, because, there was that point where you were taking day jobs and having to think of evenings and weekends as time to write. And some of the early jobs that you had also involved doing rewrites on scripts and script polishes, which I think is a skill set that people don't talk about often, but it's so specific and so necessary in the industry. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about what you learned in terms of coming into a project, bringing your vision, bringing your ideas, bringing your skill set as a writer, but at the same time having to think about writing in terms of someone else's voice stylistically at the same time when you're working on projects in that way.
I mean, polishing and rewrites is so eye-opening. It when you create and originate your own material, like I really love to do, you become so transfixed by it and so protective over it. And the best exercise is to rewrite somebody else or to polish another script, because you just don't have that same emotional attachment. And I think you can kind of see the forest through the trees. What that really allowed me to do in that experience was also become a better writer, was to think about it. How will a filmmaker think about the script? How will the studio be thinking about the script? What am I too precious about? Like, what are some darlings that I actually could kill in this piece and have it be just as good, So the most, was one of the best experiences was on Bird Box, rewriting Bird Box, working with Susanna Bier, the great filmmaker, and with Sandra Bullock and being on set, because it just forced me to think so quickly. It was like, all right, we have, 2 hours to shoot the scene. A production issue came up, so we have to shoot it in this location. Can you come up with some lines and some ideas? And that served me so well on Hunters, working with Al Pacino and Logan and Jerrica and our amazing cast. The sun was setting and we had to capture this thing. How do I, revise this scene to be better, to help Al or Logan achieve or Jerrica achieve what they're really after? So I would encourage every writer to explore those opportunities, not just create their own material, but adapt a book or rewrite a script. I think it flexes different muscles as a writer.
Yeah. And then when you go back to solos and you look at everything that you were doing on that, what did you find were the biggest obstacles that you had to overcome or the biggest challenges in creating this project?
I think part of it was limited amount of time that we had to shoot. Each episode we shot for 3 to 4 days. Of course, shooting during a pandemic is so incredibly difficult. And we, always, prioritize safety first. And at times that would compromise creative vision, but that was Obviously, most important was people's safety and well-being. So I just think there were certain limitations, with the show, but out of those limitations, honestly, came incredible opportunities. I think all the noise kind of dissipated and we really were able to focus on like what actually matters. How do we distill these episodes down to their bare essence? And it really is the power of the actor. And so what was so wonderful was feeling like out of those challenge limitations, the focus was always on the performance and how do we just support the performance?
Yeah. I mean, the performances are really astounding in it. And I think it's such a testament to you and the rest of the team in putting this together, and loved watching it. Thank you so much for this conversation, David.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you for such a wonderful conversation. Such a pleasure to meet you.